Back in March of 2022, I made a video covering some amazing discoveries in Legend of Dragoon speedrunning. This went into accessing the debug menu by using save corruption and led to runners beating the game in just under 2.5 hours over the course of that year. This category was only active for a short time before runners moved on to different ventures. There were several reasons for this, including the need to wipe ghost data off of the PS1 memory card before each run. This involves saving over previous data using other games like Mega Man X4 and Metal Gear Solid, then deleting those saves to create a memory card with zero data memory. If this sounds tedious and boring to you, then you're right on the money because this isn't a trivial setup. Combining this with a convoluted route and precise resets to corrupt save data multiple times in a run, it just wasn't a category people wanted to invest time into. However, another category called Any% Glitchless was still seeing a good amount of activity, despite it being over 10 hours long. People have been speedrunning Legend of Dragoon in this way since at least 2007, slowly chipping away at this massive game and turning it into something more manageable. Fast forward 16 years after the first attempts of the game started popping up, and the game has reached a point of optimization that no one thought was possible. On December 15th of 2023, Lasagna was able to complete Legend of Dragoon in under 10 hours without using any glitches. Now this was a big deal, especially since the last time an hour barrier was broken in this category, it was over 4.5 years ago. So to understand how good this run is, I want to talk about the history of the speedrun and the main strategies runners have used to reach the current peak of this category. Speaking of things at our peak, if you want a free and easy way to learn about the more technical aspects of runs I talk about, then check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively, with a ton of courses already available and new lessons being added each month. This might seem a bit overwhelming, but Brilliant customizes its content to fit your needs, and their guided courses let you progress at your own pace. If you want to start programming but don't know how to approach learning it, the Thinking in Code course gives you hands-on experience with designing simple programs. The way it uses drag and drop command blocks to create an understanding of how coding works is honestly really cool, and it really doesn't take that long to get the hang of it. Brilliant's interactive courses are small and easy to pick up as well, so even if you have a busy lifestyle, you'll be picking up a new skill before you know it. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for the low cost of free for a full 30 days. Visit brilliant.org/Dr. Swellman or click the link in the description. The first 200 people to click will get 20% off of Brilliant's annual premium subscription plan. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. The first attempts at completing Legend of Dragoon in a speedrun setting date all the way back to fall of 2007. Speed Demos Archive, the hub for all things speedrunning at the time, had a forum where people would come together and talk about the runs they wanted to do. If someone felt like planning out a run, a thread would be made for that game in the planning section. The run's route doesn't deviate much from the one that players take casually, so runners will look to optimize that as much as they can. Getting from point A to point B with as little movement as possible is the idea, along with managing various resources to beat bosses quickly. With that all being said, the goal of the run is to defeat the final boss, Melbu Frama, as fast as possible. Now this is a long game that spans 4 discs and about 45 to 50 hours in casual play, so it makes sense there's not many people willing to plan out a run. However, a user by the name of Omniscient came in and started the speedrunning thread for Legend of Dragoon. In his initial post, he had segments already uploaded to YouTube to document his progress. Back in the day, longer games were hard to record in a single sitting due to the technological limitations at the time. YouTube also had a hard limit of 10 minutes for each video posted, making single segment uploads impossible until much later. From September to October of 2007, Omniscient completed a speedrun of Disc 1 over the course of 31 segments. While this wasn't a full run, we can use this as a framework for what runs of Legend of Dragoon should look like. The 4 parts of the game are divided up into separate chapters, in line with the 4 discs that the game has. I'm going to assume you all watching this have played the game, but I'll quickly go over each chapter so everyone is up to speed. Chapter 1 starts in the village of Celis, where the game follows Dart and his journey through the events of the Cerulean War. This is where most of the playable cast will join the party, with Lavitz, Shauna, Rose, Hashel, and Albert all joining in that order. This chapter ends at the Black Castle Kazas, with players fighting Emperor Dole. Chapter 2 takes the party to the nearby country of Tiburoa, trying to give chase to Lloyd, one of the main antagonists who is after the Ancient Moon artifacts. Major changes to the party include a character named Maru joining first, then Congo later on, who happens to be a boss from the first chapter. This chapter ends just after the fight with Lennis and her dragon, with a cutscene at the castle and Feltz to finish the chapter. Chapter 3 brings us to Mille Ciseaux, continuing to pursue Lloyd as he attempts to obtain the Final Moon artifact. Shauna is switched out for another character named Miranda, giving us the final addition to the party for the rest of the game, and after several major points of story progression and boss fights, the chapter ends with Emperor Diaz taking the Divine Moon objects from Lloyd and revealing himself to be Zieg, Dart's father. In the final chapter, the party tries to stop Zieg from destroying 3 different signet spheres in various Wingley cities. In typical RPG fashion, the party fails in doing this, and after the moon that never sets crashes into the planet, the party traverses the moon until they reach the innermost chambers, encountering Zieg and the final boss Melbuframa. Omniscient's run through Disc 1 doesn't do much to break the mold of how players complete the game casually, opting to use the game's timed addition attacks where possible. However, there's a couple of strategies that are important even in modern runs of the game. First of all, avoiding encounters is paramount to getting through the game quickly. It takes a whopping 11 seconds to even load into an encounter and perform your first action, then about 7 seconds to reach the stat screen after the final hit. Combine this with the range of fights players can get into, encounters can waste up to a minute. When you're in an area that's not the world map and it has encounters, the indicator over the character's head will change color as the step count increases. This goes from blue to yellow and then to red, all to show how close you are to a random encounter. While you can get a good feel of how many steps it takes to get an encounter, not all steps are treated the same in Legend of Dragoon. It turns out that moving downward and or left causes the step counter to progress 4 times as fast, and so encounters happen 4 times as often. I feel like this is an obvious one, but running also increases the step counter at a faster rate than walking. Now for those of you who have played the game, Legend of Dragoon has a ton of encounters. To handle this, runners can buy charm potions from merchants throughout the game. This item resets the step count back to 0 and is typically used right before players get into a fight. Optimal use of these will allow runners to not have any encounters outside of certain forced encounters and boss fights. Now this seems like it would hurt your party due to the lack of levels and stats on characters, but bosses give a lot of EXP compared to random encounters, making the loss negligible in a run. There's also another reason runners can get away with this, and it's due to a strategy they use which doesn't require any grinding. Attack items in Legend of Dragoon are extremely powerful, especially the ones with the multi-mechanic. Multi-attack items have a base set of damage that's influenced by magic attack and elemental weakness, similar to other attack items, but these have a button mash minigame attached to them. If you mash X quickly, you can increase the damage based on the percentage on screen. However, there are percentage thresholds you have to reach in a set amount of time to continue increasing damage. Once reaching a threshold where you can continue mashing, you have 1.4 seconds to reach the next one before the attack stops. These are the 4 percentages you have to keep in mind, with the max percentage being 268%. Optimal mashing techniques were not as well known as they are now, so while people like myself can get up to around that number with no issue, back in the day it was more common to see people barely getting to that 4th threshold, if at all. Omniscient had this issue in his runs, not reaching the max potential damage for each item used. Still, even at 200%, the damage on these items is pretty good. Now looking back at items in general, it's important to note that the players can only carry 32 consumable items before their inventory fills up, so runners will need to plan out their purchases well in advance to minimize gold spending and menuing. Equipment doesn't have this problem with capping out at 255, and while runners need to keep gold in mind for buying better equipment throughout the run, space isn't an issue. One last thing you'll notice is that the Dragoon form isn't used at all in this playthrough. Not only is the Dragoon form slow to use, you also can't use items while in Dragoon form. If you're going to attack, you might as well use one of your additions, and if you want to use magic, well, that's why you have items. There are some exceptions I'm going to talk about later on, but for now we're just going to say that Dragoons suck. With that all being said, these were the strategies Omniscient used in his run, setting a decent foundation for what runs of the game would look like later. Back on SDA, Omniscient mentioned his time on his last save was 4 hours and 2 seconds, which by Omniscient's words is kinda bad for a speedrun. He wanted to come back and improve this before moving on to Chapter 2 and onward, but unfortunately that never happened as Omniscient's college courses started taking up all of his free time. Talks about the run were ongoing in the SDA thread, but no one stepped up to the plate to do the speedrun. Sometime between 2011 and 2013, there was a livestream casual playthrough by FFGamer86 all done in a single sitting. This clocked in at just over 25 hours, but I was unable to find surviving footage of this run. Now, the only reason I know about this run is because in February of 2013, a runner by the name of Railkin did a Legend of Dragoon run of their own and mentioned it about a third of the way through.
The only recorded run of this game, single segment, was FF Gamer's casual playthrough that was like 25 hours.
By this point, recording longer runs was much easier than when Omniscient was doing his segmented attempts. Live streaming on Twitch became a huge staple in the speedrunning community as it allowed people to show their runs in front of a live audience and save their entire streams for later viewing. With that being said, Railkin's run finished at 13 hours, 3 minutes, and 59 seconds. Many of the strategies here are mirrored from Omniscient's run, but just done faster and spread to all 4 chapters of the game. Multi-attack items for bosses and charm potions for random encounters make their return, but there's a couple more things to take note of for the later parts of the run. Repeatable items are hidden throughout the game, and they're very important to keep characters on par with some bosses. These items don't disappear after use, but they have only one use per battle. Most of them are stat modifying items such as speed up, speed down, power up, and power down. However, there's some that do different things, such as the Psychedelic Bomb X attack item that players get in Aglis during Chapter 4, after answering all the questions correctly from the Courage test. This repeatable item does non-elemental damage to all enemies, which is strong against all other elements. Super useful for the rest of the game. But if players answer even one of these test questions incorrectly, they get the non-repeatable version of the item, which essentially kills the run. Speaking of the rest of the game, Railkin maintains the party of Dart, Haschel, and Maru at the point where all 3 characters are assembled. These characters are used in particular due to Maru's high speed and magic attack, and Haschel's high speed and attack. Outside of that, Railkin then uses a lot of the strats previously mentioned, with some focus directed towards using additions and leveling those in the Dragoons. Dragoons are leveled with the SP that's accumulated from regular attacks, so additions that generate more SP are better in getting these levels faster. I know I said earlier that Dragoons were slow, but there's 2 instances where it's used to Railkin's advantage. The Zieg fight before Melbu Frama is annoying and can take a long time if he's constantly using his spells. To make this fight go by as fast as possible, the idea is to get Maru's Dragoon up to level 3, then use her spell Freezing Ring to deplete a lot of his HP. This, in combination with some attack item use, makes this fight trivial. The final boss, though, is a bit more complicated. Melbu Frama has a whopping 42,000 hit points, the most out of any boss in the game, and is separated into 4 forms. His first form has the main body and 4 tentacles to deal with. Railkin starts by using some items and Dart's Dragoon attacks to take out the tentacles, and hopes for a specific attack where he summons 3 virages to deal damage. Once this happens, Melbu goes into a counterattack stance where if the player attacks, he'll counter with some damage. During this time, Melbu stays in this stance until attacked and doesn't perform any other actions, and this is where his AI can be manipulated. It turns out, Dragoon form attacks don't count as a normal attack, so Railkin uses Dragoon attacks and items to keep Melbu in that stance until the 3rd turn. On the 3rd turn, if a character attacks normally and Melbu counters, he'll use the Virage attack and go into a counter stance on the next possible turn. Railkin abuses this to have the safest phase 1 as possible. As for the rest of the Melbu fight, a mix of Dragoons and items are used to get through. Phases 2 and 4 can be particularly annoying and slow things down, but Railkin managed to keep up the pace, closing out the run after about 38 minutes of fighting. While this is the first real record since people started working on the run back in 2007, it wouldn't be long before other runners were set on beating it. Another runner by the name of Jimmy Jamma 15 got a time of 12 hours, 57 minutes, and 13 seconds on November 13th of 2014. The link to this run is on speedrun.com, but unfortunately the video was never highlighted and thus the run was not saved. Actually, the only run that exists anymore from this user is split up into 62 different videos on his YouTube channel due to the 15-minute limit on uploads at that time. This record would be short-lived, however, because another runner on the forums by the name of Deathtome claimed various times that were much faster than that, one with a turbo controller and a couple without it. Back in the day, discussions around turbo controllers were almost taboo, as many communities saw them as being the equivalent of a tool-assisted speedrun. Those arguing for the controllers mainly wanted a way to keep players from damaging their hands and dealing with conditions like repetitive strain injury. Eventually, turbo controllers were allowed by the community, so from here on in, I'll just refer to the fastest glitchless time out of the two types of runs. The times that Deathtome mentioned unfortunately don't have videos or links on speedrun.com. However, there is an existing non-turbo record he achieved on December 14th of 2014, which we can look at for his route changes. Deathtome focused a lot more on using items for damage instead of straight up using additions, dishing out more damage per turn on average. Speaking of which, Deathtome's mashing technique was amazing, with him getting up to the 250% range and beyond consistently, even at the end of his runs. Another time save was not getting the talisman in the Valley of Corrupted Gravity. This accessory prevents instant death by can't combat attacks, very useful in some fights to prevent deaths for multiple characters, and saving revival items such as Angel's Prayer. This saved about a minute, plus reduced the risk of encounters in the valley due to not traversing as much ground. This did add risk to other fights such as the upcoming Virage 2 boss encounter, but Deathtome targets the boss's body part, which does the instant death attack, to prevent that issue from coming up in his run. For characters, Deathtome used Rose in his party up until after the Divine Dragon fight in Chapter 3. The third character was swapped around until Maru was picked up, then Maru was used in the rest of the run. This was due to a mix of Rose having decent stats in the early to mid game, and Maru for reasons we already explained. Hashel still replaced Rose for the rest of Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, and in order to catch up on Addition and Dragoon levels for the final fight, Addition grinding was done on the boss Imago. Imago has the second highest HP out of any boss in the any % glitchless run, with the final boss being the only one with a higher HP pool. Imago also has 3 forms, 2 of which are good for grinding additions due to how low damage they output. The final form has a lot of deadly attacks, so it's a DPS rush with no time for grinding. Both Railkun and Deathtome spent somewhere between 13 and 15 minutes on this fight, grinding out both additions and Maru's Dragoon level to 3. Outside of those strategies, Deathtome just had better movement, menuing, encounter management, and luck to top it all off. It would be a while before another record would top this, but on January 19th of 2016, Deathtome would get a time of 11 hours, 15 minutes, and 3 seconds while using a turbo controller. Many parts of this run look similar in strategy to the last one, but the main thing is Rose was switched out for Maru as soon as she was recruited into the party. Going back to the rest of the game with Hashel, Dart, and Maru as the main party members. Most of the fights were just faster in general due to the guaranteed 268% damage on the multi-items, but there were also refinements in the later game, like 6 minutes being cut off the Imago fight just as an example. However, there was another major point of time save that didn't have anything to do with the run at all, but instead relied on the hardware runners were using. Back in August of 2015, Deathtome posted on SDA that certain PS2 consoles saved an estimated 1 second per minute of gameplay, or about 12 minutes over the course of a 12-hour run. PS2 consoles had different models over the course of their lifespan, and I'm not just talking about the fat and slim versions. If you look at the bottom of your console, you'll see the model number at the top of the label. It was previously thought if you wanted to have the fastest console to run Legend of Dragoon, you'd want a 75K or 77K model. This is where it gets weird. There's a disk speed setting in the PS2s where you can set the disk speed to fast for faster loads in game, but on the 90K and 79K models, it didn't work for Legend of Dragoon even if the player enabled it. The PS2 has an internal list of games on these models that don't allow the fast disk speed setting to be activated for, as Sony identified issues with these games on that setting. Legend of Dragoon had issues with soft locking, but it was mainly from doing things like using Dragoon form in certain boss fights and then dealing with the soft lock later on, which had nothing to do with disk speed. It was found if you load up a game with fast disk speed on a supported game, you could switch out the disc for Legend of Dragoon on the PS1 logo screen, with the console still loading Legend of Dragoon. This helped a ton in improving the record, and it would be a staple for runs going forward. A few years later, Deathtome would be the first to break the 10-hour barrier with a time of 10 hours and 53 minutes on the dot. This run did not use turbo, but it made up for it with the incredible reroute that happened during the time between the two runs. While it was theorized back in 2016, and some runners such as Kyo's Little Monster were looking into it, Deathtone put the pieces together and used what was called the Wonder Woman route in a run. The idea was to kill off party members in boss fights and leave only a single character alive. When getting experience from an encounter, the EXP is split between all living characters in the active party. So for example, in Frugal's first boss fight, you get 300 experience after the battle. If 3 characters are alive, they all get 100 experience. If 2 are alive, the living characters get 150 experience, and if 1 is alive, then that character will get all the experience from the battle. This also helps with your characters on the bench because they get 50% of the EXP that your active party gets. With this in mind, Deathtone wanted to focus all of the experience on Shauna as much as possible until she gets switched out for Miranda. If this is done correctly, Miranda comes into the party at level 28 as she ends up matching Shauna's level when she's switched in. This meant that Maru was completely removed from use in the main party in favor of Shauna and Miranda. This strategy continues into the late game, putting Miranda at level 46 by the time Deathtone reaches Melbuframa. With her having the highest magic attack stat in the game, attack items used by her deal a ridiculous amount of damage. The need for manipulating Melbu's AI in the first phase is no longer needed, and it really just comes down to hitting Hex Hammer additions on Hashel and spamming attack items with Miranda. Not long after this run though, Deathtone deleted his Twitch channel as he felt he accomplished his goal of streaming. He wanted to show that he played legit, and since he was able to prove that to the community, he now wants to be able to concentrate on a good run and publish when he's satisfied, without the distraction of Twitch chat or anything else. Unfortunately, the side effect of this was that it took away a lot of the documented history of the game, similar to the runs missing from Jimmy Jamma years before. Many of Deathtone's runs are still on his YouTube channel, but some are now lost to time, only existing by word of mouth from those who were around during that era. Though this is the last surviving record from Deathtone, we already know that this wouldn't be the last record ever. In fact, starting in late 2020, the any percent glitchless record would start being pushed down a lot more often. A veteran RPG runner by the name of Black Death Doom picked up Legend of Dragoon and was quickly improving his times using a variation of the Wonder Woman route. BDD made some small improvements over time to this route, and eventually set a no turbo record of 10 hours, 42 minutes, and 41 seconds on September 9th of 2020. The route changes were relatively minor at the time, but BDD claimed a lot of his time save came from the console he was running on. He made a post that his 77K PS2 helped him save a whopping 41 minutes with the help of load times compared to his last PB on his 90K. This time save was a lot more than what Deathtone initially thought, despite it not being clear how much truly came from loads and what came from BDD's performance. What was clear, however, was that BDD was great at mashing out multi-items and had excellent knowledge of game mechanics in general. There were even some instances when he wanted to conserve charm potions where he'd use an exploit called encounter buffering. This is a really cool mechanic where after cutscenes, menuing, screen transitions, and interacting with things, you have a second or so where your step count doesn't increase. So if you know where you want to move when doing any of these things, you can just hold the direction you want to go and avoid encounters while doing it. While a limited version of this was used by Deathtone back in 2016, eventually the community found out the ways I mentioned to use it. BDD also worked in Albert instead of other characters for funneling experience through dying, because like Dart and Kongal, he has 0 base evasion and attacks will never miss as long as they don't have evasion equipment on. These things and more are what carried BDD to his next 2 records without turbo. The first being a 10:37:30 on December 6, 2020, and the second being a 10:31:49 on January 24th of 2021. This record was more of the same, and BDD was even behind at the end of Chapter 1 this run, but he had a new trick up his sleeve for the Dole fight. Dole has 2 phases, one in his regular form where he does simple attacks, and his second form when he turns into a Dragoon and his abilities expand to ones that can be annoying. Outside of wasting time with spells, he can use an ability that shields him from all incoming damage for a certain amount of turns. This wastes around 2 minutes waiting on his shield to come down, but it was found out that runners can possibly skip this by dealing 900 damage or less to Dole. This is because Dole will always use his shield on his first turn at 899 hit points or less. Once runners reach the damage they need, they just defend until his next turn to see if he does something other than shielding. This is done in this way to ensure that Shauna and Rose get a combined 3 turns to kill Dole before he gets in his next turn. The downside is that there's only an 18% chance of this working, but since it's only time loss compared to a run flat out dying, at the time BDD was okay if he didn't get it.
You got it. You got him. It's free, guys. Every time. No way. What do you mean, no way? You know who you're talking to, right? Bruh, I'm the fucking best.
BDD got it, and while it wasn't the only reason he got the record, this was both the first time he attempted and successfully performed the shield skip in a run, which in my opinion is an absolute power move. The chat was even helping him through it, with a certain world record holder making sure he performed the strategies correctly. A couple more strategies found by Lasagna would be implemented in runs as the time continued to come down, some of them thanks to ideas from another runner named Murasaki Beans. In Kazas, more of the guards that runners didn't believe could be skipped got their skips, thanks to specific movement setups that made them consistent. Remember, encounters waste a lot of time, so removing these was huge for the run. It's also important to note that all of the records from here on in use turbo, giving the runs consistent 268% multi-item damage and perfect tech smashing through dialogue. BDD would come back and get the record 3 more times, working to include all the new skips and refine his time loss from previous records. His final time from this grind came in at 10 hours, 22 minutes, and 23 seconds on April 10th of 2021. Again, a lot of this is just tightening up the route that's already there with focusing all the EXP on one character. BDD had instances of time loss both in and out of his control. He even messed up the EXP route where Albert survived on the Kraken fight in Naglis, putting Miranda at level 45 instead of 46. This meant less damage output during the final fight. Regardless, he was able to pull through and secure this record. For the first time in a while, the record would sit for longer than a couple months. Thankfully, it wouldn't be years like the last time the game settled down like this, because 8 months after BDD's record and after contributing so much to the community, Lasagna would set some top times of his own. Lasagna first streamed runs of a category that defeated Faust, one of the hardest super bosses in the game. Eventually, he'd get a decent time and move on to any percent glitchless, quickly closing in on the record. It only took less than 2 months after Lasagna started doing runs of the turbo category to get an unofficial record of 10 hours, 18 minutes, and 2 seconds. The only reason this ended up not being a true record is because of the game getting stuck on one of the FMV cutscenes in Chapter 3. This typically happens when the console can't read the disc properly due to either disc damage or there being something wrong with the lens. You can open the disc tray and close it to skip the cutscene, but because this can be done on any FMV scene, it's not allowed in the run. This wouldn't stop Lasagna though, because he got his first record a week later on December 18th of 2021 with a time of 10 hours, 16 minutes, and 45 seconds. This started out with an amazing shield skip at the end of Chapter 1 after a slow beginning of the game. He did have some time loss on the second Virage fight as it took forever for Dart and Albert to die, and he input the wrong code when amending the laws in Xenobatos. The Melbu fight was also kind of slow, with him losing time on phase 3 and 4, which cut his lead down by minutes. This was still the record however, and he wouldn't stop there either. Lasagna ended up getting 4 records, with his last one being a 10 hour, 4 minute, and 51 second time achieved on May 12th of 2022. Again, this came from getting better RNG on various sections of the run, closing the gaps on potential time save. He did get a couple of extra encounters overall, so he knew that getting under 10 hours was completely in reach. However, a familiar face would come back and get the record next, with BDD dropping a 10 hour, 2 minute, and 54 second time on April 4th of 2023. BDD was already on the cusp of the record with a 10:04 after getting back into the category while Lasagna was on break from any percent glitchless, so it was only a matter of time before he'd catch up. Now optimizations at this point were starting to be few and far between, but one thing that was noticed was when hitting thresholds on the multi-item attacks, the extra damage was unnecessary in ending the encounter. Each time a new range is hit on the percentages, the animation will continue to go for 1.4 seconds. Now this doesn't seem like much in the way of time loss, but things like these add up over the course of the run. This would carry over to Lasagna's run just 11 days later on April 26th of 2023, when he beat the record by just 19 seconds. The time saves over the next few records for Lasagna were extremely small, so the problem he was seeing was getting both shield skip and good RNG at the same time in the run. If he got one, it looked like he wasn't getting the other. This would result in a 13-second improvement 3 months after Lasagna's first record back, and a 3-second improvement another 3 months after the last one. Lasagna was still determined to grind out the sub 10-hour time, knowing that the time saves would come together at some point. We know that, of course, because if you remember, I already spoiled the time for you at the beginning of this video. Lasagna ended up getting the shield skip in most of the major time saves in the same attempt, landing him a 9-hour, 58-minute, and 1-second run on December 15th of 2023. Just a quick overview of this run, his Chapter 1 was pretty good, getting shield skip. Chapter 2 ended up being average, but also having a gold split at the beginning of it. Chapter 3, however, had incredible RNG where he got his best times 5 splits in a row leading into Chapter 4, beating his previous Chapter 3 sum of best by 31 seconds. There were a couple major points of time loss, both in Xenobados where he messed up the law application, and another on the Zeke fight when he ended up having bad luck with the abilities he used. But it all came together on the final boss, as Lasagna got his best split ever thanks to how good the fight was. While Lasagna knows this can be improved, he's opted to move on to other categories in the meantime. Currently, he's practicing playing Legend of Dragoon while blindfolded, working on Chapter 1 right now as a new challenge. Honestly, I'd love to see at least a segmented speedrun completed while blindfolded, and if that does happen, I'm sure I'll be making another video to tell you all about it. Stay hydrated, folks, and thank you so much for watching.